I'll be so glad when the sun goes down.
On August 21st, 1831, Nat Turner armed slaves and led a revolt in Southampton County, Virginia, that took a stand against slavery, resulting in the death of over 60 white people and inspiring slave rebellions throughout the South. Nat Turner was born on October 2nd, 1800, in the Southampton County of Virginia, on the plantation of prosperous slave owner Benjamin Turner. Child of slave Nancy Turner and an unknown father, Nat Turner was born into a life of slavery. At the time Nat was born, the abolishment movement in the North was growing increasingly stronger. In the South, the Underground Railroad had just started to form, and the amount of slaves escaping was increasing drastically. Many slaves who later escaped slavery in the South became active abolitionists, such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. The abolishment movement further south, however, was not taking off. Slave owners weren't going to give up their life of luxury and free labor easily. Nat was taught to read by one of Benjamin Turner's sons. After the passing of Benjamin Turner, Nat was sold for $400, quite a considerable amount for a slave in the 1800s. In his lifetime, Nat Turner was sold as a slave 3 times, his last owners being John Travis and his family. Nat was a hard worker, and when he wasn't at religious slave meetings, the majority of his free time went to praying, devotion, and fasting. There are even claims that Nat baptized himself in a pond near the Travis plantation. At the religious services for slaves that Nat often went to, he was a fiery preacher to his fellow workers. The first time that a voice spoke to him, Nat believed that God had chosen him for a task. What the task was, he had yet to figure out. In 1825, Nat had a vision. He saw white and black spirits engaged in a bloody battle. Nat took this as God telling him that he was chosen to rebel. Later, in early 1831, Nat interpreted an eclipsed sun as a sign to start planning his attack. Nat and 4 other slaves from the plantation set the date of attack to July 4th, 1831. However, due to Nat falling sick, the slaves had to postpone action. They took this time to recruit 2 more slaves. On the evening of August 20th, 1831, Nat Turner and the 6 slaves he had recruited met in the woods near Cabin Pond. They discussed a plan of attack that they had kept a secret for weeks. They departed their ways after settling on a time. At 2 o'clock in the morning the next day, the 7 slaves met and set off towards the Travis family's house, the first house out of many that they planned to attack. On their way to the Travis house, the slaves stopped at the Giles Reese house, where Cherry, Nat's supposed wife, had lived. They quickly killed the Reese family and continued on. Once they eventually made it to the Travis house, they snuck in and quietly murdered John Travis, his wife, and his children. As they secured their new guns and horses, the slaves realized that they had left a sleeping baby in its crib. One of the slaves was sent back into the house to kill the baby, while the rest continued on. As they went from house to house, they recruited slaves from the plantations after killing their owners. To their disappointment and ultimately their demise, many slaves refused to join them, fearing the large risk of failure. There were many slaves who openly disagreed with Nat, and they protected their owners from him. Slaves owned by Richard Porter warned him of Nat, giving Porter time to escape with his family. Others, however, were not as lucky. In the Catherine Whitehead house, locally known as the Sykes house, all 7 family members were murdered. They were buried in the family garden shortly after the revolt. In total, Nat and his fellow slaves managed to recruit approximately 70 other slaves by going plantation to plantation. It was a considerable amount, but not nearly the turnout that Nat had wanted or expected. As Turner's force continued to grow, Virginia's governor, John Floyd, received word of the rebellion. Floyd quickly requested for permission to use military force against the slaves, and the government accepted his request. John Floyd deployed over 3,000 troops to stop the rebel slaves. The slaves were met by the troops, and they quickly realized that they were heavily outnumbered and outgunned. The slaves quickly dispersed, trying to escape their sealed fate. The majority of the slaves ran towards the woods, where they knew would make it easier to elude capture. Unfortunately for them, the troops were quickly able to catch up and capture them. The slave revolt had only lasted 2 days, ending on the night of August 23rd. 3 days after the slaves were defeated, August 26th, Nat Turner was the only slave part of the revolt that had not been captured. As Nat was hiding from his captors, innocent slaves were being murdered. Up to 200 slaves who had nothing to do with the revolt were either beaten or brutally murdered by white mobs seeking revenge. On September 17, 1831, Benjamin Phibbs, a local farmer, found Nat hiding in the woods near his farm. The emaciated Nat was captured at gunpoint and led to the local police. Authorities brought Turner to Southampton County Jail, where he was housed for several weeks. While in jail, Nat was interviewed by his lawyer, Thomas Ruffin Gray. The interviews would later be published as part of a book. Nat's trial occurred on November 5, 1831, and lasted less than 48 hours. Turner was tried and convicted of conspiring to rebel and making insurrection. After being thrown in jail for another 6 days, Nat was publicly hanged on November 11, 1831. Nat's dead body was decapitated and quartered to set as an example for slaves across the nation. Multiple suppressive policies against blacks were set, including the requirement of a white minister at black worship services. The education of slaves also became illegal, with owners believing that educated slaves were more likely to rebel. Nat's story was covered with dust when it was once again brought up in the 1960s, during the heat of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. Nat stood as an inspiration to both the followers and the leaders of the movement, with monumental figures such as Malcolm X quoting Nat in his speeches and rallies. In 1966, Herbert Aptheker, a well-known American historian, published a scholarly work on Turner, including his confessions while in jail. Just the following year, in 1967, William Styron published another book on Turner, which also contained his interviews. This book, however, received harsh feedback, with numerous historians saying that Styron's book was largely opinionated. The Southampton Slave Revolt was just the beginning of Nat Turner's legacy. Nat's actions led to something much more than just a revolt, leaving an impact that still resided after the 13th Amendment was passed. His impact lasted throughout much of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, arguably one of the biggest movements in history. It also spanned across the Black Power movement, where, like Nat, African Americans used violence to try and achieve their goal of equality. Through numerous boycotts and trials, like Montgomery and the heart of Atlanta. Nat's impact lasted through all of that and more. Even to this day, Nat has had part in changing the course of our lives. While slavery was banned many decades ago, we have yet to reach social equality. Groups like Black Lives Matter are attempting to bridge the gap, but we still have a very long way to go until everyone is treated equally in every part of this nation. Historically, Nat's role has been widely debated, and throughout time, Nat's image in society has been ever-changing. Lately, however, the tides have been turning as books and movies are being released that portray Nat as what many believe him to be, a hero. Nat's great act of rebellion was not only leading a revolt that played a huge role in abolishing slavery, but having the courage to stand up for the rights that we, as humans, deserve. Nat Turner took a stand for what he believed was right and what we now know is right.
And Jesus got his crown in front of a crowd. They march with the torch.